Philosophers talk to our times towards an ethnography of a self-poisoning mind. One of the problems that liberal democracies have is their failure just simply to accept that Marx is fundamentally right about the iron rules of capitalism. Rules that if you simply ignore, all you discover is that nothing really ever changes. That the rules kick in. Oh, you can have alternative rules. I'm not an evangelicalist when it comes to Marx. Absolutely not. As all figures of the left in Britain are, at my heart there's a little bit of me that remains liberal Keynesian. Just a little bit. Because it seemed to me that in a remarkable period just after the Second World War, you could have some sort of alliance between socialism and Keynesian economics. Although I think it will not work anymore. I remember back when I was 20 years old, I argued that we had to be back on the Marx agenda. That rigid agenda was what was always born out of things like Thatcherism. Because its assertion of neoliberal realities, hate the phrase, old classical economic theory would put you back in the Marxist frame. And here we are, with a population that is feeling revolutionary. And why? Well, very straightforward. In the kind of setup that we're in, it goes without saying that democracy is fundamentally, now I don't want to use a full phrase, flawed. I think I would actually say deranged. Yes, deranged is about the best word. You see, on the one level, there are some iron rules kicking in. Iron rules about the powers of work, of workers and the powers of bosses. Iron rules about the relative effect of technology on society. Iron rules about the growing power of corporations when they are left unchecked and untrammeled, and about who capitalism serves. All of which are just straight out of Marx. Straight out of Das Kapital, chapter 15 on machines, and the way machines revolutionize how we have to understand who and what we are, and so that we understand ourselves through the machine and we lose sight of any notion of humanity. All that's jazz. Okay, they're kind of hard rules that if you indulge in a techno in capitalism, invariably follow. But the politicians simply ignore the fact. And that means you get caught up in a system where you get the traditional political parties who are saying, well, we're going to solve everything. We're going to make things a little bit better. Well, we're going to do something. Well, it's not going to be that bad. And are promising, if not the moon, at least to make things better. And yet, because they're unwilling to challenge any of the overall structure, nothing ever changes. If anything, it just carries on getting worse. And the fact that, 70% of the population in... Now, that's in America, I seem to remember. But it's even more here in Europe. Really don't want data centres. And don't want the new internet, which is being foisted on them. Simply gets ignorable because structurally it is ignored. Because capitalism ignores it. And everybody just goes, well, you don't know what you're talking about. They probably do. At which point, democracy then becomes a choice. You could have left-wing parties, but for reasons of structure and reasons of genuine threat, which I'll come back to, nobody's really allowed to vote the left. That cacophony of media pundits, of right-wing voices, of the endless howl against the left, and the threat they say it poses to everybody's money, by which they mean their own, mostly, or perhaps to the theory of money itself, howls out even relatively moderate left-wing voices, so that they are treated as if they were Robespierre at the gates. Which then, of course, means that the only other choice is you either vote my dog R as Prime Minister, which wouldn't be bad. She would allow us all to bark incessantly and chase deer. She's just found one. Or you vote for the human equivalent, a pig in charge, or an idiot, a fool like Le Pen, or a fool like Farage. These are vainglorious idiots who under the normal run of politics wouldn't stand a chance against a proper politician. They go to pieces in interviews. They're unable to put forward coherent policies that could be costed out. None of that. And yet we live in countries where it is conceivable they win. Certainly France next year, because the centre haven't even managed to find a candidate, looks like a straight fight between the hard left and the hard right, except the hard left isn't that hard. It will just get demonised out of hell. And all the rich money is now going on Le Pen, which is actually what's happening in France. It's worth noticing that, because that is deeply troublesome. It also gives lie to the fact that Le Pen is anything like a friend of the people. She isn't, of course she isn't. But the point is, in a sense, her very ineptitude, the very fact that she would be the worst president the Fifth Republic has had since the last one, and wouldn't be able to even attempt to be any good, is almost the point. Because democracy has become deranged. It's come to the point where you might as well elect my dog or Le Pen, because you're not allowed to choose the people who would actually make a choice. You live in a society which is structurally squeezing you, squashing you, for good old Marxist reasons. That is, it is a society of untrammeled capital, where profit gets squeezed by laying off the workforce. Straight AI stuff. And people will say, well, we'll just lay off the workers and then we'll be able to make more money. Forgetting all the obvious traps, apparently, that lie in this version of the capitalist utopia of ours. All that jazz. And you can see it. It makes change very difficult. Because actually, if you really want to change the system now, you probably have to go along the Marxist model. It becomes, and this is the problem, is where I would think that failing any attempt to be able to go back to some sort of Keynesianism, which isn't going to happen, we'd probably need a war to do that. Although I did have hopes that a climate emergency might allow us to do it. What Keynes allows you to do, you see, is to reform the economic system from within, to actually melt it down and move all the contours a bit, and then a bit more, and then a bit more, by allowing governments to be able to change what they can do. Failing that, you need a revolution. And the problem is, everything else is just going to be pissing in the wind, where you're always going to come up against the hard Marxist rules, sooner or later. And all the good you do, all the attempts of good that you do, will just blow shitty in your face. And so that change becomes increasingly difficult, increasingly devalued. And the problem is with all of these, that very often the trope of the right, the power of the right, I mean the far right, of that cacophony of voices, the shitty orchestra, is that when honest attempts to change the world a bit from within fail, founder against this sheer inexorability of the system, inexorability, the fact that it will not change, then the cacophony of voices say, well, we told you nothing could change. We told you we were right. We told you that women should stay at home. We told you you should not have professors who weren't white. We told you all of that, and now you didn't listen to us. So look what happened. So I have two examples. One is the obvious one, and one is an example from a friend. Let me do the obvious one. The obvious one is Britain. It's the entire issue of having a black professor of education. Now here I have to confess an interest. I have always found education departments peculiarly jargon-ridden and utterly inept. This is as a teacher. Now, it is actually probably what all secondary school teachers think about university educational teaching, because it's almost its job is to piss you off, to make you go off and do your own stuff. But I have always found them, I don't mind jargon, and I'm going to do a piece on jargon later on in the week because I think it needs to be talked about. But But jargon ought to describe a world that you couldn't otherwise describe without the jargon. It ought to mean describing the undescribable. It oughtn't to be recodifying the world that you actually live, that you already have very good words for, and making it sound more difficult than it is. So I'm not terribly surprised that a education professor has had plagiarism issues in their work. If I'm honest with you, I'm not terribly surprised. I wouldn't be surprised whatever colour they were. If they were a Martian, I wouldn't be surprised. Yes, I'm a bit going and my knowledge of academics, all it wants me to do is to use the same attention and same sharp, hard line on various right-wing academics I could think of off the top of my head, all of whom I suspect would wither under the same kind of glance. Now, that's my prejudice coming through. It does have to be said, but I do think it needs to be said. This idea that academia somehow is it's very good at finding plagiarism in students, undergraduates, but that's because academia exists as a system for bullying undergraduates and taking off their money and not giving them a proper education. You might notice a certain level of bitterness here. I did manage to get myself sacked from university, partly because I was a good teacher, but it's all a different story and it's ancient history. So, first of all, I'm not absolutely certain where the scandal is. The scandal might be the entire structural system. In fact, that is what I think it is. And the problem is, of course, then, if you try to reform it from within, if you try to say, well, we can't reform the entire system, but we can allow certain people, certain voices that were never heard to be heard. Your problem is, how do you do that? In a system which is fundamentally other than it pretends to be. I mean, the entire education system and the position of universities within that system. I've long since given up even trying to work out what universities are for. I mean, they're for research, but a lot of the research didn't really need to be done at all, or didn't need to be done that way. What universities are not for is what they're paid for, which is teaching, because they're not very good at that. And all the rest of it. Again, when I used to have a little sideline, I used to live in a university city. I had a sideline in teaching students of philosophy and politics, students who were at the university, the courses, as a tutor, simply because they were taught so ineptly at their colleges that I could make a living out of it. So I can't moan. But it tells you how poor universities were at teaching. And my point, I guess, with all of this is that the entire system is fairly unrobust, fairly problematic. Therefore, if any attempt to reform it is likely to be a deep jump in the dark, because they don't know quite what they want. And so they will reform by just going, well, you'll do. You've got a good story, a backstory, a sad story. You'll look right on the pictures, because there's nothing else for them to do. Because it's not like they were what they pretended to be in the first place. And therefore, the person they want is a person who isn't going to shake up the entire system, isn't going to say, well, actually, this entire system is corrupt from beginning to end, and we need to rethink it. A system that was based on hiring posh white males, that then got a crisis of confidence about hiring posh white males and started to hire other people, but fundamentally didn't change any of the structures, it's always going to be problematic. And then not very good at choosing how to variegate itself. None of the structures were changed. And without changing the structures, all you get is exceptionalisms and kind of footnotes. And so the entire thing ends up as one great long jot in the moribund history of universities. The second example is what I would call the feminist example. I have a very good friend here in France. And she once said to my partner, actually, she didn't say it to me because I think she wouldn't dare. She said, I'm not a feminist, I'm an anti-feminist. I think feminism did a lot of damage. It took women from home and it made it feel terribly unacceptable to be a mother and a housewife, because that was what she wanted to be when she had her child. Now, I would die in a ditch to save her to be a housewife as she wants to be. But I would also call myself a geet-hard feminist. I always would have done. In that I believe in total equality between men and women, And if that means positive discrimination on behalf of women in order to get them into roles, I'm perfectly happy to accept that. I've always thought one of the cards I've never played is being a posh white male or a dyslexic, come to that matter. Because yeah. So I think positive discrimination against women, reforming the vocabulary to allow the workplace to be genuinely open. Making men too scared for the routine sexual abuse that otherwise happens, that is just part of our society. I'm all for that, always have been. But there's my friend saying, I'm against it because it keeps women in their place. And then she made a point that's very reasonable. And she said, look what the effect of feminism was. The effect of feminism was that capitalism simply went rampant, where before one job would keep a family. Now 2 jobs keeps a family. And doesn't really do that. Because all that happened was the entire system expanded to allow for both people working. And if both people don't work, there's a financial stick that beats them. And that, of course, hits something deep about capitalism. Something that I and my ilk should have remembered, because we have read Das Kapital. And one of the things Marx says in Das Kapital, in the capitalism of his day, the husband worked as the capitalist for his family, renting out his wife and his children for labour, living, drinking off their profits. Dickens is full of characters who do that, actually. And one of the things that Dickens is doing, he's part of that evangelical movement of the 19th century that put women in the homes, that made it a Christian duty to have a housewife and a mother. There's nothing old about trad wives. Really nothing. I mean, the current model came from the 1950s, but it was based on this kind of middle class ethic ideal, where to be wealthy was to have a wife that didn't work and didn't have to work. And then that becomes the norm as the line for a just society within the 20th century. And the point is, yes, feminism did sweep it away. And what that was a jot. It was a little note within capitalism saying, well, what we can do is we've got a little bit of leeway here. It's not really leeway. It was, although it was in the Keynesian age. It simply enforced a fold, a kink within capitalism, which made sure that workers were paid enough to keep a family. And if you boot that away, then the high-end rules of capitalism simply kick in. And actually, by doing good, you're in such a worse position. And that, I think, is the theme of today. It is terribly easy either to do nothing or to do good in the system we're in and simply make it worse. Endlessly a bit worse and a bit worse until people think, well, I might as well elect somebody who's going to make it a whole lot fucking worse. Because why not? And unless you allow those left-wing governments in, unless you really start to think of systemic change, unless you flirt with the idea of using environmentalism to return to some kind of crypto-Keynesianism that allows you to reform the system, genuinely reform the system, melt it down in a white-hot iron from within, then you're going to have to use a revolution to change anything. And that is bloody and unpredictable, but in the end, inevitable.